Hi guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Despite still leading the championship by a comfortable margin, Max Verstappen is not happy at the recent progress from Red Bull and the RB20, believing there must be more performance in that car than they are currently unlocking. This comes at the same time where Jos Verstappen, Max's father, is supposedly completely convinced Mercedes is the place to be for next season and beyond, and it could well be close to convincing Max of this possible reality if anything that's happened over the last couple of races is anything to go by. Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. So much great support on the channel over the last couple of weeks, and we have plenty to talk about here because Racing News 365 understands Toyota is coming back to Formula 1, apparently with Haas. There's been some speculation for now a couple of weeks really on exactly what might be going on here, with one of the top guys at Toyota spotted in the pits with Haas at Silverstone last weekend, and then apparently after Le Mans, Ayao Komatsu, of course, team principal of Haas, was in the Toyota Gazoo Racing hospitality suite immediately afterwards. So there were then rumours emerging, is there a potential Haas-Toyota tie-up coming soon? And let's be real here, Haas are a pretty attractive team at the moment, far more attractive than I expected them to be way back at the start of the season. So according to rumours, this is potentially nearing a done deal. It's going to be an Alfa Romeo-esque relationship initially, like a sponsorship deal where effectively Alfa don't do much. They just say, hey, we want to sponsor your team and kind of have it as our team effectively, but then possibly, as Audi are kind of going to do, take that whole thing over. So that's a possibility for Haas over the coming years. Toyota looking to get back involved in the sport. It is rather likely, it seems at this point, they may have a sponsorship relationship with Haas in the near future, and then that might potentially become a Toyota team proper over the next couple of years. So that's a big one to keep your eyes up for. Big breaking news as of yesterday. This was another one that I know was causing a lot of interest really in the community because Rolex have sponsored Formula 1 since, I think, 2011. Before that, they had Hublot, they had other brands, and apparently they might be coming back. So Rolex's deal, which I think was initially about $10 million a year, is now more like $50 million a year. LVMH Group, as in, you know, owners of TAG, Hublot, other brands, they are looking to spend a lot more than that. So apparently, Rolex is going to go from Formula 1 and it's going to be, you know, TAG on a full-time basis, or maybe even Hublot. Hublot, controversial brand if you guys are familiar with the watch world at all. But this is pretty interesting. I know that people will miss, I suppose, the classic Rolex clock ticking over to the top of the hour and then the formation lap gets underway. And also classic images such as this and many others, with, you know, the Rolex crown lining up with the top of a driver on the podium. They will probably be no more if this is anything to go by. Speaking of Hamilton though, his engineer for next season will likely be Riccardo Adami, former Vettel man, now Sainz's guy, and arguably a bit of a better race engineer than I tend to have on the Leclerc side of the pit wall, because this was kind of interesting to note this weekend. Sainz was one of the few drivers that actually made, in general, the best decisions, because Verstappen and Sainz were the only two drivers to pit, at least at the front runners, on the perfect lap when it went to inters. So they stayed out on the mediums through the initial rain, unlike Perez, unlike Leclerc, for example, their teammates, and then Verstappen and Sainz both chose exactly the correct lap to go onto the inters. That, of course, allowed Verstappen to create the undercut on Russell and was right back in the race at that point. Sainz was a bit further behind, although actually Sainz in that Ferrari wasn't too dissimilar in terms of competitiveness with Verstappen at that point in the race. But this was interesting because the drivers have to have some idea what the weather's going to do. They obviously want to rely on their pit wall to decide when it's going to be necessary to pit for inters. But in terms of the Leclerc side of the pit wall, what he was getting told, yep, heavy rain coming soon. It's just about to come on, and, you know, therefore Leclerc was like, okay, hey, we got to come into the box. However, what Sainz and his engineer decided is they will use a basically terminology to describe it to the driver based on what the radar looks like. So at some point those guys have agreed that they will use either cyan, yellow or red effectively to determine how heavy the rain is going to be. So his race engineer told him cyan in 3 laps, growing to green, yellow in 2 laps. And Sainz is like, okay, describe the rain quick in 2 laps, cyan in sector 3. So pretty interesting to hear that, right? And it ended up that Sainz did make the correct call on the lap to pit on as a result of all this stuff. So maybe something to learn learn there for Leclerc's side of the garage, and also maybe for McLaren, who also made some kind of howling decisions during the Grand Prix. Ferrari, though, they've got a lot to think about as well. We know that Enrico Cardelli has left. He's gone over to Aston Martin. That apparently, though, he will be bringing in new engineers after the summer break. Now, whether that's going to include Adrian Newey, that's obviously been one of the big debates as of late, but apparently Vasseur is going to restructure the technical department for the longer term. Whether that's going to end up being good or bad, who knows? But of course, there's a general feeling that the team needs to really get into gear by the time Lewis Hamilton arrives, and Hamilton will help with that to some degree. He's obviously going to attract many engineers interested in working with him. That's one of the benefits that Ferrari gain. Vasseur actually made quite clear exactly what his deal is, saying that, yeah, Hamilton wanted this Mercedes deal initially, but then they would only offer him a 1+1 deal, and, you know, because they were wanting Antonelli or maybe even Verstappen or whatever to come in next, and therefore Hamilton didn't really feel as valued at Mercedes as Ferrari made him feel, and therefore Vasseur said he had to make the hard choice. Where do I have the greatest chance of winning the World Championship in either 25, 26 or 27? He then said Ferrari, so kind of confirming that yes, it is a 3-year deal. Whether it's a 2+1 year deal with options on either side, that is probably the most likely, but yeah, Mercedes wouldn't offer him this deal, and of course there was a risk then that, let's say, Verstappen or whatever magically became available for 2025 or 2026, for example, then maybe even if Hamilton had signed or followed on with that extension, he finds himself all of a sudden out of a drive. So, you know, that's, I think, why one of the reasons he made this move. And he says, we've got good people at Ferrari, but I want to strengthen them in the team. Lewis was an important symbol because he sends a positive message to the paddock for the future of the team. But of course, as of late, it ain't been looking so good. Apparently it was the floor they introduced in Barcelona, the new floor, which has triggered the return of the high-speed bouncing, right? This is the concern that every team has, that as you chase more and more towards the performance ceiling of the cars, trying to add more downforce, you always run the risk of the car starting to bounce again. But it seems Mercedes are able to generate nearly as much downforce as McLaren and Red Bull, but can do so on certain conditions, potentially even better than anybody else, and they don't get, you know, the porpoising bouncing phenomena that Ferrari are now dealing with yet again. And as I said yesterday, pretty remarkable how Nico Hülkenberg has actually outscored Leclerc over the last 3 rounds. In the meantime, while they are bringing new versions of the car, right? So new side pod design here that Haas unveiled at Silverstone, and it's interesting that Ferrari are regressing at the same time that Haas are actually making some progress, right? Just because, you know, the theory goes that Haas are better this year because Ferrari are better this year, but Ferrari actually aren't that much better this year now compared to where they were at the start of the season, and yet Haas are still making some strides. So a couple of interesting changes. This one was notable though because Magnussen actually preferred the older version. Hülkenberg preferred the initial one, or the newer version. Magnussen didn't have a bad race, but he didn't finish in the points. Hülkenberg had an absolutely spectacular drive, making largely the right strategic calls all the way to top 6 in the end. He finished P6 in the race. Next year, though, that might not be the case because he's going to drive for Sauber, who are not looking so good at the moment. Just quickly on Sergio Perez, this is currently the lineups for next year, but we know that Perez, despite being confirmed, is not exactly a guarantee based on his recent performances. There are, of course, a few other drives yet to be determined, and also you've got to wonder if this Haas-Toyota thing goes through, whether their second driver alongside Behrman is somebody that maybe Toyota wants in the car. So that is one to stay on tune as well. But let's talk about testing that's going on, because Mick Schumacher, of all the options that McLaren have, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? They've got so many drivers in their junior programs, obviously driving for their IndyCar team or whatever. And instead of getting all of those guys, they bring in Mick Schumacher, Mercedes, and even like Alpine now for the WEC side test driver to come in and drive instead. Albon drove for Williams, Behrman drove for Haas, so some Pirelli rubber testing basically. But the big story really is about Liam Lawson, because he'll be driving, I think it might be today or tomorrow, a test at Silverstone in the RB20. Now you guys may well remember, this is very similar to what happened last year with Daniel Ricciardo. You guys may remember when Daniel Ricciardo was in the Red Bull, the RB19, last year at Silverstone, just after the Grand Prix, and the lap time that Ricciardo did, adjusted for conditions or whatever, would have been good enough for second on the grid just behind Max last year. So that's pretty much what got Ricciardo his seat back in the sport in the second half of the season, and the question has therefore been raised, could it do the same thing for Liam Lawson? Is it possible that Liam Lawson, as a result of this test run, given that you've got to think it's not a coincidence that Lawson happens to be doing a test right about now at the same time that Ricciardo did last year to earn his spot back on the grid. So for Lawson, I think this is pretty much, all right, let's see how you get on in the RB20. If you deliver, then not only might you be Yuki Tsunoda's teammate at RB, you might even be Max Verstappen's teammate at Red Bull for the rest of the season, depending what they are thinking about the results. And also depending how much Horner wants to keep Max Verstappen happy, because, you know, if he asks Max what he thinks, Max also probably wants a bit more support. Yes, Max wants a teammate that he can easily beat. I imagine most drivers would. But he also wants a driver that actually has his back to some degree sometimes, which has clearly not been the case, obviously, as of late. So that's why there's a lot of question on this. So if Max were to choose, maybe he would choose Danny Rick back in the car, which might put Liam Lawson potentially at RB alongside Yuki again if Perez was to get the boot. But of course, we're going to see about that. But speaking of Red Bull, they have not been on the best trajectory as of late. They have still scored, in Max Verstappen's hands, the most points over the last few races, at least Max has. But the team itself has not, and this comes at the same time where Brackley, as in Mercedes, are extremely confident about their progress. They have more upgrades for Hungary, they have more upgrades for Belgium. Of course, Hungary, historically a phenomenal Grand Prix as well for Lewis Hamilton, had pole there last year, has won there 8 times in his career previously, so lots to be said on that. Now, you know, Formula Uno do say, like, maybe this was just the best you're going to see from the W15 just because of the conditions, front limited circuit, cold conditions, low grip conditions. Those are generally where the Mercedes seems to be strongest, and that potentially remains true. So their setup window was good for this particular set of track conditions, but Hamilton was, over the course of the Grand Prix, the fastest man on the track. Now, maybe Norris should have won with a better strategy. Maybe they had the best car. Clearly, in the first stint, Max was, you know, about 3.5 tenths off the pace of the Mercedes and the McLaren on average over the first couple of stints through the mediums and on the interstint, especially on a weekend where Max had an upgrade, right? They had an upgrade on Max's car, which they didn't have on Sergio's car, and Verstappen says, yeah, probably that did something, but it frankly did not do enough. Now, look, Max would still have been in the hunt for pole, if not would have maybe got pole if he hadn't gone off track, of course, and damaged his floor during qualifying, but he did. So he ends up only 4th, and from there, fighting for the race win was hard. He nearly got there based on good driving from Max and good strategy from Red Bull, but of course was probably 2 or 3 laps too short to actually get the move done on Lewis Hamilton. But Verstappen says he doesn't believe they're reaching their potential, the RB20 right now, which of course also implies he ain't particularly happy about what they have done over the last few rounds. And he even made the point a couple of rounds ago, like, look guys, we've got to bring more upgrades here, like what are we playing at? Now, over the first 6 or 7 races of the year, yeah, Red Bull were the fastest car by a mile, really. However, since then, Monaco, Canada, then of course like Spain, Austria, they were fastest, and then Great Britain, it's dropped off to some degree. And in terms of deficit to the fastest time, we see a rather different trend here from Red Bull at the top in the blue than we have seen at the start from them at the start of the season. So this is when there's been questions from Red Bull and from Max as to, okay, what's the future going to be here, guys? Because all of a sudden I've gone from having the best car by a mile last year and the best car at the start of this year to now being in a fight every single weekend with basically no teammate to back me up. Horner says, yeah, we're finding diminishing returns, which is probably true for every single team on the grid, but also you've got to understand that they have the testing time deficit, right? They have the reduction, and now of course the 2021 cost cap penalty reduction is now over, that's no longer relevant, but the testing time limits based on them being first in the championship are potentially starting to take their toll. So as Verstappen says, I refuse to believe that we can, you know, no longer keep improving the car because then you get lazy. I'm confident they've won in the factory, they're always pushing flat out to try and bring bits of performance to the car, but clearly there's lots of smart people in the world and other teams that are also doing the same thing. So, you know, he's not been massively impressed, obviously, by what Red Bull have done over the last few rounds. It's kind of crazy, isn't it, how Newey announced his departure back in Miami. And I know that, like, there's obviously more to it than that, but Newey announced his departure, and then basically ever since then, they have not been, on average, the fastest car. That's probably McLaren. And Verstappen says, yeah, basically the rules are to try and slow down the winning team by reducing the testing time allowance they have. You get only 70% of the allocation, roughly, for being the number 1 team, as Red Bull have now been for some time. time. So look, he says, we see the gain in the floor performance, and this weekend's been a bit hit or miss. The weather doesn't help. We've got to keep pushing, got to keep bringing bits. But yeah, Verstappen not massively impressed. He says, yeah, we're not reaching the ceiling. I'm sure we're not, but we're not really delivering anything that's getting us much closer to that ceiling, given the fact that the other cars are bringing upgrades too. And as he says, yeah, we've got more to come, but I hope that our bits will be better than the bits that other teams bring, which are, of course, potentially going to be rather good. And over the last 5 rounds, this is points scored. Mercedes 142, McLaren 141, Red Bull 105. Now, the vast majority of that, of course, is for Max, and that's still ahead of Ferrari, but even Haas have scored 20 points, which is more than Sergio Perez has in that time frame. So this is when further questions have been raised on Max Verstappen's future, right? Because even after the British Grand Prix, Toto Wolff was talking a bit about Max and saying, well, he got a good look at the back of our car for that Grand Prix, so he knows, that it's a pretty good car nowadays. We'll see if that remains true over the coming rounds. We know that Jos Verstappen, though, Max's father, had a big falling out recently with Christian Horner. Okay, they've had a falling out for years, but recently it kind of went to the next level because Jos was meant to drive an RB8 at Silverstone, and Horner said, I think it was Austria, wasn't it? He was meant to drive an RB8 at Austria, and Horner said, no, you ain't, sunshine, and then kind of denied it publicly. Anyway, there's drama there. Jos then said, I'm done with Horner, I've had enough of this guy, and I think Jos has been quite convinced for some time that he wants his son at Mercedes. He thinks Mercedes is the place to be from 2026, and, there's an argument to say that Mercedes' car and current evidence will be good enough in 2025 to challenge for race wins. Maybe not the championship, but honestly, who knows? If Max backs himself to really deliver in next year's Mercedes car that is currently right up there as being one of the most competitive cars on the grid, why not make the move if in 2026 it's looking good, right? So apparently Jos Verstappen is going to effectively present arguments to Max and his actual team, his own manager, to say, look, Mercedes are going in the right direction, Red Bull are declining in XYZ way, Mercedes are probably going to have just as good of a car next year as Red Bull are, and then in 2026 Mercedes is the place to be for engine reasons, etc, etc. So apparently Jos is convinced that Merc is where he needs to be and therefore where Max needs to be. And okay, we've got to just quickly mention the fact that Max is under contract until 2028, but the rumour has it that if Max wants to leave, then Helmut Marko will simply resign, and if Helmut Marko resigns, apparently that then activates a contract clause for Max, which allows him to just walk away and breaks the contract. So that's just worthy to note. And also just this quickly, that Horner, as he says, there will be an engine penalty for Max this season. Probably they're going to take it in Spa, but it's really not all sunshine and rainbows right now, and Max is still good enough to always maximise the results and just be incredibly impressive week in, week out. But is he making the right decision if he stays at Red Bull for the longer term? That genuinely is a question right now, based on his own words and the words of his father over the last couple of weeks. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Just one final thing to bring to your guys' attention. This is the new Prima Variante at Monza. So just to compare the two sections here, this at the bottom now, they're not quite perfectly aligned, but it's actually pretty good on this one. This is turn 1 Monza. We're coming in from the bottom here, of course. This is the runoff area where, Vettel went through when he had the brake failure, all that type of stuff. So they've changed the corner to some degree. It's now slightly differently shaped, as in the tarmac goes deeper, cuts back a little bit further, and then is a bit wider on the exit, but still narrows quite a lot on the exit here. So this seems to be their attempt, Monza, to try and improve the racing at this corner, because especially in these big cars, it's always a bit of a clumsy corner, I thought, and kind of difficult to race side by side. Certainly the older version, you guys can see at the bottom, so thin that really racing side by side here isn't really possible. Someone often has to take to the runoff area or just bounce over the curb, like what happened with Max and Lewis back in 2021. So I think what they've tried is probably good. It means that you can go in a bit deeper as well, because the corner is designed in such a way now there's more tarmac, so you can potentially send a bit of a lunge there, and maybe there's more room to actually create a switch back on the exit. So I don't know if it's really going to work, but I guess I maybe think it's worth a try, because a bit of a clumsy corner. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.